parent would come to me with an autistic child, for example, and they would say, I did stem cells. And for a period of months, it dramatically improved my child's digestive symptoms. But then it all just slowly came back again. And that is, again, because there was something underlying that was not able to be addressed. We've seen this. We've talked about this a few weeks ago, right? Where cancer patients, for example, no longer responding to a cancer drug, get a-FMT, they now begin to respond to the cancer drug.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another amazing, wonderful, super great episode of Biome Breakthroughs. Today, I'm really excited to talk about this topic. Not only have we just put together a really interesting white paper on this, it's just something that I find myself and Jason end up talking about pretty regularly in our day-to-day conversations because there is a global rise in the talking about and the doing of stem cell therapy. I think we're seeing it more, and it fits really in with the kind of growth in regenerative and longevity medicine, as well as personalized medicine, and really understanding the person along with the disease.
Yes. And I think what's cool too is that there's a huge overlap between the types of indications and diseases that stem cells are being studied in, as well as FMT or microbiota transplant therapy. And so it's really cool to see that they're both sort of identified or being used in similar conditions. And so it's cool to see that happening. And then, will be more cool once we have data combining the two.
Yeah. And I think kind of this growth and appreciation for stem cells really does align with the growing interest in the gut microbiome as the ability to provide some enhancements in longevity, as well as an option in terms of part of or as a treatment for many chronic conditions. And so I think we're seeing that FMT is emerging as a possible adjunct or an enhancement to these stem cell therapies. And we kind of term it as synergistic, working together. And I think this comes from not only the gut-brain connection and the gut-immune connection, but the idea that the gut microbiome is playing a really large role. But when it's dysbiotic, the body is dysbiotic, right? And extended periods of dysbiosis in the gut, I think, leads to systematic inflammation. It's huge changes in the immune system. And with this, I think how we respond to a treatment is going to be impacted.
Right. And I think as well, typically in scientific research, you're looking at one intervention, right? Because you're trying to prove or get the understanding of what does this one intervention do in the context of whichever variables you're studying, whether they're like biochemical markers, some sort of blood markers, whether they're actual symptom tracking. All of those things are how interventions are typically studied. And that's very understandable, right? You want to understand how a drug or a product or some form of treatment is going to impact very specific markers. And that helps you understand how that drug or product has an impact on those symptoms. But I really think the future of medicine, and this is how clinical medicine is practiced broadly, right? You're never generally doing one thing at a time. I mean, it's always interesting to just do one thing to understand, okay, how does that one thing impact this patient? But broadly speaking, I think there's, especially in clinical medicine, but I think research in time will start to recognize the importance of combining therapies that will have a synergistic approach. And we've seen this, we've talked about this a few weeks ago, right? Where cancer patients, for example, no longer responding to a cancer drug, get FMT, they now begin to respond to the cancer drug. So as we're identifying limitations of certain drugs or interventions, it's going to be natural to then look at, okay, what other therapies, what other products, what other drugs could be combined with something that we know has a positive effect, maybe potentially or a low or even a high, but safety or risk profile, right? What things, more than one, it could be two, could be three, could be multiple. What things could be combined together to improve safety, improve efficacy, and overall, whether it's survival rates or whatever the marker is. So I think that's really the opportunity from a clinical medicine standpoint. And that's, who we are here at Novel Biome, serving practitioners, healthcare providers who are really leading these multi-intervention approaches to healthcare and have been since, the dawn of medicine, really. But I think that's the future of where medicine ought to go as well, from a research standpoint, is combining multiple therapies to see if we can get better outcomes, better safety profiles, etc.
Yeah, and I think we need to change how we're asking the question, because I think if you look at the research, which is, where I live, I swim in it. It's that if you see one treatment that's being used in 10 conditions and another treatment that's being used in 10 conditions, but there's definitely something missing in both of them. There's a cap, there's a plateau. And we talk about this a lot with practitioners, is evaluating until you reach the plateau and then understanding what that plateau means. And so in terms of plateau, it's just, there's no changes or the changes are slowing down. But if you see two that almost fully overlap, I think it's important to look at why. Why are we looking at these two different treatments in all of the same spaces? And is the thing that's causing the plateau possibly solved by the other? And this is kind of the question we asked when we started evaluating the idea of, is stem cells and FMT synergistic? And I think one of the things that's kind of mind-boggling is that the overlap in what's being asked is almost exactly the same, as well as the issues that arise for stem cells. So like graft versus host or antibiotic resistance bacteria. Both of these are concerns in stem cell. Both of them can be solved, mitigated, or lessened using FMT. And so I think if you see, this is our shortcoming in stem cells, like graft versus host. How do we evaluate this, especially in cancer treatment? But if you have something, we know if we solve the gut microbiome problem here, we reduce or get rid of graft versus host. I think that then starts to see, well, there's got to be some other overlap. And I think that's, for me at least, that's where I started with the question is, what is FMT doing that we know is a fit here? And then where else does it overlap? And I think we can talk about, immune modulation and inflammation control and why that would be important for stem cells in terms of using FMT. And I guess maybe that's something you can talk a little bit more on, because I think this was the part that I found really interesting, because we know the gut microbiome plays such a big role here, but it is a concern in stem cells as well.
Right. And even the theory of how these two different treatments impact clinical symptoms is really related to, they both have an effect on the immune system. They both have an effect on reducing inflammation. And we know that those two factors, when out of control, lead to, or worsen all of these diseases. Like all chronic diseases are an immune system that's out of whack, and which then drives inflammation to be out of whack. And the whole goal of everything we're trying to do, when you're thinking more from an integrative, holistic, functional lens, is to create balance within the body. I mean, that is the outcome. And so in clinical practice, just for a little bit of context, my background as a naturopathic doctor, spent many years treating hundreds of patients. And a lot of patients would come to me and say, okay, I'm thinking about either stem cells or FMT. What should I do? What should I do first? How do I think about these two things? And my approach at the time, now a lot of the research, this was several years ago, a lot of the research is now showing that there's very likelihood for synergies. And we're seeing some practitioners who are already doing this, which we're very excited about. And we're happy to welcome more practitioners to the fold who want to understand this and utilize these synergistic therapies within their practice. But my very basic interpretation and explanation at the time was, we know if you have gut dysbiosis and you've got a whole bunch of symptoms of GI dysbiosis, whether it's, constipation, diarrhea, food allergies, leaky gut or gut permeability issues, neuroinflammation in the context of autism and some other neurological diseases, we know that FMT, it's been very broadly researched in a lot of these disease states, shows a lot of benefit. Again, a lot of overlap with stem cells. The trouble is that stem cells go where the inflammation is. That's their trigger. It's like firefighters to a fire, right? Like the firefighters, they look for smoke, they see flames, that's where they go. And then it's, the responsibility of some other firefighters to check other buildings, check to see if there's other people, that maybe crawled out of the fire. But that's the general mindset. And that's how stem cells are driven. They go to the source of inflammation. Now, you want your stem cells to go to the source of inflammation that they can permanently correct. You don't want them going somewhere where they're only going to have a transient benefit, right? And so if there's a lot of inflammation within the gut, because of GI inflammation due to microbiome imbalance, which pushes inflammation within the gut, and you sort of have this low-grade festering inflammation. It can be tested with CRP, HSCRP, calprotectin, whatever the markers, there's lots of them. When you have that low-grade inflammation and the cause of it is due to microbiome imbalance, by doing stem cells, you're not going to correct the microbiome imbalance. It's just not the mechanism of action. It helps to reduce the inflammation, helps to heal and regenerate tissues. But if the underlying cause is not addressed, you're just not going to solve the problem. And I've seen this a ton in clinical practice where the parent would come to me with an autistic child, for example, and they would say, I did stem cells. And for a period of months, it dramatically improved my child's digestive symptoms. But then it all just slowly came back again. And that is, again, because there was something underlying that was not able to be addressed. So the whole concept of doing FMT then is to actually deal with this underlying imbalance within the gut microbiome, which in and of itself will reduce inflammation both in the gut as well as the rest of the body, including the brain. It'll help to heal up the intestinal lining and the GI tract in general. And then later on, when you're doing stem cells and the GI inflammation is reduced because of the FMT and rebuilding the gut microbiome and sealing up this gut permeability and all the other wonderful benefits that come with doing a microbiome transplant, those stem cells will then go find other sources of inflammation, like in the brain or other tissues in the body that are inflamed, but it can be regenerated, rebuilt, so that they go in and they actually have a permanent benefit. It's not a transient benefit, it's a permanent benefit. And so that's a perfect example of how FMT, rebuilding this gut microbiome, shutting down inflammation, moderating and rebalancing the immune system, can actually then enhance the outcomes of a stem cell therapy treatment. And so I think that's, really the simplistic way of thinking about this, although there are many other mechanisms which you wonderfully pointed out in that white paper, which we're happy to share for anybody interested. But yeah, so that's typically how I thought about this clinically, how I would talk to patients about considering both. I'm a huge advocate of stem cells, but I think the order needs to be rebuild the gut microbiome, reduce the inflammation so that when you do these stem cells, you're going to see better benefit. Now, the question we don't have the answer to is how soon after starting FMT, doing a microbiome transplant, can you do stem cells? Is it days? Is it weeks? Is it a month? Really, we don't know. And that's the great thing about deploying this in clinical practice. We'll get a better sense of it.
And I think we see that, using FMT, it's going to help enhance engraftment, which you've touched on. It's going to create a better systematic environment. But as well, we know FMT does some really wonderful things like, enhancing short chain fatty acids, which are really important. It's going to help increase the good metabolites that the gut's going to produce. It's going to help increase or improve the gut barrier function. So all of these things in conjunction, things we just know FMT does really well, are all things that are also important in stem cells. And so I like to call this is a logical leap. So we have enough information on both of these treatments in standalone that we can make a logical leap that there should be really good synergistic profiles here. I think the other important thing is we know that FMT can reduce side effects and make or reduce the risk of some of these side effects. So I think that's also an important part to kind of round this out, that it's also supportive in terms of reducing side effects. And I think that's also plays a role in kind of understanding it. And I think, we don't know, is it better to do FMT, then do stem cells, and then finish off with, a post FMT treatment to kind of thing is, do you only need it pre? Is it best to do it, I think
combined.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of questions there. And I think part of it is understanding what we know today and understanding what the goal of each of the treatments is, and then how that logically makes sense, I guess, in your practice. And I'm hoping we see more of these kind of grouped treatments, and that in total, we start approaching how we research drugs in general, or pharmaceutical options, because one of the things that I've always found really interesting is the beginning parts of any research in terms of how to treat a disease is looking for someone that only has that singular disease. And I think if you look at the ones that we've been most puzzled by, things like autism, when we're looking at Alzheimer's disease, most of them are neurological, mostly because we're a little bit still perplexed as to how the brain works, but nobody just has one of these. Or how we describe the disease is not all encompassing. And so then they end up with a number of diagnoses. And I think if most people who have it have two others, they're probably all interconnected. And we know that, part of this is there's a lot of overlap, and maybe we're just not asking the question correctly or not looking wide enough. And that's something we are seeing a change in. But maybe the reason why we're not seeing or kind of appreciating wide scope some of these functional options is because when you're looking at functional integrative medicine, everyone's looking at the person and not each disorder individually. And I think that's the idea. If someone has a number of diagnoses, there's still one person housing all of those. You can't look at each of them as separate bodies, right? So I think that's part of this story is how do we ask the question that actually looks at what that person is kind of facing, and then what's each symptom and how does that kind of all go together to make that picture. And when we're looking at the research, we're seeing the overlap in stem cells and FMT in neurological diseases, MS, Parkinson's, autism, and longevity-based or neurodegenerative disorders, and then autoimmune conditions, so Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, arthritis, things like this. Both of these have huge overlaps. And so I think it's understanding what's in common across all of these and what do we know about how the gut microbiome is part of this so that it makes sense in conjunction with stem cells.
I'm with you. Amen, as they say. I mean, that's really I think the future, again, of medicine, and this is why I'm so excited about where medicine in general is moving to, is because we do need to take this whole body, all systems, individualized patient treatment approach to care, right? And also multidisciplinary. There's no such thing as one specialty or one way of doing almost anything for everybody, right? Like that just doesn't apply. It's just like the age-old question, like which diet is the best diet? There is no one best diet. It's about what works best for the individual. And so I think that's the same for treatment approaches. There's never going to be one singular way of doing this, approaching a patient's care. But there is a combination of ways that I think will get better outcomes. And I really encourage when we're talking to more integrative functional doctors, I do believe you're going to get a better treatment outcome when applying FMT or stem cells or any of these other awesome therapies that exist out there. When you're doing a lot of this foundational work, right? Like if the patient has already made changes to their lifestyle, stress reduction, improved their sleep, improved their diet, removed some of, what are often blocks to healing, then when they do these types of treatments, they're going to get an even better outcome because the body is like geared up to get better outcomes due to the limitations or removal of some of these, what otherwise would be blocks to healing. And so that's where I think, really taking this holistic, wide lens approach to how we treat and care for people on an individual basis is going to be really transformative. And the research, as we're seeing, is really backing this synergistic approach of combining a microbiome restorative approach to improving their dysbiosis or microbiome profile while considering the same benefits for stem cells. So I think the synergy is fantastic. And I'm really excited about working with more doctors and teams who are already applying stem cells and or already applying FMT as a treatment, thinking about combining these for these patients. And in time, we'll get better insights and data from these combination therapies. And of course, as always, we'll be sharing them here. And,
I think we can see that integrative practitioners are uniquely positioned for this. And if you're listening to this and being like, I need to know more about this, like there's got to be more. I have questions. That's what we're here for. Please reach out to us. We want to have these discussions. Every time we talk to someone, I learn something, and I hope they feel the same way. But the idea here is these discussions are just as important as all of the other pieces, because we have to keep talking about what's working, what's not working. What are the puzzling moments where you go, I just don't know what the next thing is, or how does this fit, or this symptom doesn't make sense with all of these other symptoms. I don't know. And I think something to appreciate It's not about not knowing, it's that we just are figuring it out. There's so many things that literally the rate at which information is being published since about 2023 to 2025, in terms of gut health, in terms of diseases, in terms of new spaces that we're looking at how it could play a role, is insane. It is overwhelming, the number of research papers that are coming out. And it's great because these are really good questions and we're seeing the topics expand. And I think that highlights how we have to start asking the questions. And could this possibly be? Is it the answer to everything? No. If you just watch our podcast, you may think it is, because we tend to really narrow in on it. We talk about the things that make sense in terms of the gut. And not every person is a fit. But I think you have to ask the question, is it part of the puzzle or is it not at all? And I think maybe we don't always appreciate, but when you look at gut dysbiosis, so when someone is in a flare or their gut isn't working properly, the impacts on behavior across conditions, how symptoms will get worse, is pretty consistent across a number of different conditions. So it's not just the gut. Sometimes it's mood, sometimes it's tremors, sometimes it's aggressive behaviors. But these two things we know are correlated. So maybe it's important that we start asking the question and then start saying, what pairs well with this? Or what am I already doing that I think should work better? This should work for this person. Maybe there's something missing that we need to change first so you get a response. And so we always talk about kind of evaluating each situation and then figuring out, would it be a fit? Is it not a fit? But we're always here to answer those questions and help puzzle out, because we're just as likely to say, yeah, this logically makes sense, to go, yeah, this isn't what the issue is. And that's part of why working, I think, with someone that's so research focused like myself, someone so clinically focused like Jason, both of us come at it from very different aspects and are able to look at it in different ways, but come to the conclusion of going yes or no, or maybe, which is sometimes the answer. Maybe it's, you kind of have to keep looking. And I think this is an important conversation, not just in terms of stem cells, but in general, looking at how treatments together work synergistically and how that will approach for each individual patient versus kind of trying to fit everybody into one square hole, when they're a star.
Right. And I think having that maybe answer is sometimes what these people who, as a physician you're dealing with, who are chronically ill and they're really struggling and they're willing to try stuff. They're willing to experiment. And so I think, this is a bit of a call to arms to anybody offering integrative treatments, especially if you're doing stem cell treatments, to consider FMT and to reach out to us. We've got a ton of research that we've put together. And I mean, you pointed it out, right? There's hundreds of new studies coming out all the time. And that's really the advantage of working with us. We'll share all of that. We'll give you the resources you need to make your own informed decisions, whether that's the papers, our write-ups, anything that you might need to better understand this topic. So you don't have to spend, days to weeks combing through all of this. Maybe a synopsis summary with all of the links to the papers is going to satisfy your interest in experimentally or in a pilot way approaching this on an individual patient basis, getting more comfort, and then deciding, does this synergistic approach work for the types of patients I treat, or does it not? And if it doesn't, that's interesting as well. But yeah, so really excited about being able to have those types of conversations, bring more doctors who are already doing these individual therapies into the fold to try to ultimately get better outcomes for patients. Because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that really matters and moves the needle, right? You're in medicine to help patients get better healthcare outcomes. And I think this combination approach is going to be a really valuable tool to individual practices and clinicians all around the world.
And I think we're going to get more data, and providing support and understanding allows people to develop protocols and gather the research and gather the data that comes along with that. And so I think it's important to understand that gut could be part of the problem, and just asking that question. Don't ignore gut symptoms, or understand that maybe resolving those symptoms will improve the outcomes for stem cell, I think is important. And like we've mentioned a couple of times, we put a white paper together to try to kind of understand this topic. And this is something, one of our goals is to constantly, when either we're proposed with a question or when we come up with them on our own, is to research and put something together to answer that question as best as is possible with the information that we have, and then continue to update them as more stuff comes out. And we want to be a source of knowledge because I think that allows better decision making, but also it's really hard. There's so much stuff coming at you. And, where you can get support, ask for it. That's the whole, everybody together, more hands makes light work or something like that. And so please reach out if you have questions, if you're listening to this and going, it's really interesting for stem cells, but I'm doing something else. And I wish I understood how that overlap is. Send us an email, send us a message. And we will try to understand that question and kind of support that, because if you have that question, there are many other practitioners that are asking the same things. And so let's all support each other by asking the questions and getting the information, the resources that can be provided. Where we can, we will.
Agreed. Love it.
Perfect. So if you have questions about FMT, if you want to better understand where the gut microbiome might fit in, if you just have a question about the gut microbiome, either look at our other videos, because we've been making these for a bit now. And so we've covered a lot of topics, but reach out to us. You can email us. It's all in the description below. Or if you just want to read this white paper that we're really hyping up to today, it takes a long time to write these, and so I will baby them for the rest of my life. But reach out to us, read it. We'll have a discussion, and we just want to be as helpful as possible. And we love talking to people that are in the field, talking to patients. That's kind of where our happy place is as well.
Agreed. Expanding access to FMT. That's it.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much for joining us. There will be another episode, and I would tell you the topic, but I'm sure we'll change our minds 100 times, and will be whatever the most interesting thing is that comes up when we sit to record. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you guys are subscribed and following along with Biome Breakthroughs, and you'll note that we'll have some extra guests with us as we're trying to interview some practitioners as well, to give you guys more voices and more insights that aren't just from the two of us. Thanks, and see you next time.